What if the most painful part of Prince Philip's marriage to Queen Elizabeth was not an affair, a public argument, or a dramatic separation, but one official document signed only weeks after she became queen? Philip had already surrendered titles, nationality, religion, and the identity he was born with. Then came a decision concerning his children's family name that reportedly left him feeling powerless. Decades later, Princess Anne would offer a very different perspective on her father's life and final years. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden sacrifices behind their marriage. And before we begin, subscribe for more royal stories. The public image of Philip and Elizabeth's relationship has always looked remarkably stable. They married in 1947, remained together throughout Elizabeth's entire reign, raised 4 children, and appeared side by side at thousands of official events. But their private circumstances were far more complicated than those photographs suggested. Philip entered the marriage carrying a difficult personal history. His family had been separated, his father was largely absent, his mother had suffered serious difficulties, and his sisters had married into German families. By the time he met Elizabeth, Philip had already experienced uncertainty that most people around him could hardly understand. Philip's childhood left him with very little that felt permanently his. His father, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, eventually lived apart from the family, while Philip moved between relatives and schools. His mother, Princess Alice, spent periods away from him because of her own struggles. Philip's sisters were also living separate lives, many of them in Germany. One of the few personal objects connecting him directly to his father was a signet ring that came into his possession after Andrew's death. Philip reportedly wore that ring throughout his life, making it a powerful symbol of the identity he carried into his marriage. Philip and Elizabeth's relationship began before the world knew them as the future King and Queen of Britain. They met properly at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth in 1939, when Elizabeth was still very young and Philip was a naval cadet. Their relationship continued through letters during the war, but there was an important difference between them. Elizabeth belonged to a secure royal world with a permanent place waiting for her. Philip did not. His life had been shaped by movement, uncertainty, and family separation. When their relationship deepened, Elizabeth offered him love, but she also represented the possibility of finally having a permanent home. Philip's family history also created difficulties when the possibility of marriage became serious. His sister Cecily died in an aircraft disaster in 1937, along with her husband and children. Philip attended the funeral in Germany while still a teenager. The tragedy became part of a complicated family history because some of his relatives had connections with Germany during a period when Britain's relationship with that country was becoming increasingly hostile. Philip himself served with distinction in the Royal Navy during the Second World War. Yet when his future marriage was considered, his family background remained an uncomfortable subject for some members of the British establishment. Before Philip could marry Elizabeth, he had to make extraordinary personal sacrifices. He gave up his Greek and Danish royal titles, became a British subject, changed his religion from Greek Orthodoxy to Anglicanism, and adopted the surname Mountbatten. The changes were not merely ceremonial. They represented the removal of much of the identity he had been born with. His engagement to Elizabeth, therefore, came with a price that is easy to overlook when looking at the photographs of their wedding. Philip was not simply gaining a royal bride. He was rebuilding his entire identity around a woman whose future position would eventually dominate both of their lives. Their 1947 wedding contained another reminder of how complicated Philip's position was. Several of his German relatives were not invited because of the political atmosphere following the war. His mother attended, but much of his immediate family was absent from the ceremony. Philip reportedly accepted the decision without publicly creating a scene. He continued forward with the marriage and began building a new life in Britain. Yet the symbolism was difficult to ignore. Elizabeth entered the marriage surrounded by her family, while Philip entered with very little representation from his own side. It was an early sign of how unequal their positions could become. For a few years, Philip experienced a version of married life that gave him genuine independence. During their time in Malta, he served with the Mediterranean fleet, while Elizabeth joined him there. She could live with fewer royal restrictions, and Philip could continue developing his naval career. According to the source account, those years were among the happiest periods of their relationship because neither person was constantly surrounded by the machinery of Buckingham Palace. Philip was still a naval officer rather than simply the Queen's husband. But that freedom disappeared when Elizabeth's father died in February 1952, changing both their lives permanently. When Elizabeth became queen, Philip's professional future changed almost immediately. His naval career came to an end, and his responsibilities were redirected towards supporting the new monarch. The man who had commanded a warship now had to adapt to a role where his wife stood at the center of every official decision. He could no longer simply choose the direction of his career. The crown had its own structure, its own advisors, and its own expectations. Philip had married Elizabeth, but he had also entered an institution where the sovereign's position naturally came before the personal ambitions of her husband. Then came the issue that would reportedly become one of the deepest sources of Philip's frustration: the family surname. In April 1952, shortly after Elizabeth became queen, a formal declaration established Windsor as the name of the royal house and family. That decision meant that Philip's children would remain associated with Windsor, rather than simply taking his Mountbatten surname. The source presents this as a devastating personal blow, because Philip had already surrendered so much to enter Elizabeth's world. His titles had changed, his religion had changed, his career had ended. Now even the family name attached to his children was being determined by the crown. What made the situation especially painful was the timing. Elizabeth had been queen for only a short period when the declaration was made. According to the source, Philip privately expressed his frustration at being unable to give his own surname to his children. Whether every later interpretation of his reaction is accurate is difficult to establish, but the underlying conflict was real. The royal family operated according to traditions that did not function like an ordinary household. Elizabeth was sovereign. Philip was her husband. That distinction affected everything from their public duties to the way their children were formally identified. Their marriage, therefore, had to exist within rules that neither could simply ignore. The 1953 coronation brought that difference into full public view. Elizabeth was crowned queen, while Philip performed a ceremonial act of loyalty toward his wife. He knelt before her and swore an oath of service as the monarch. To millions watching, the moment appeared deeply romantic and symbolic. But there was another way to understand it. Philip had once been a prince in his own right and an accomplished naval officer. Now he was publicly demonstrating that his role existed beneath the authority of his wife. The ceremony captured the unusual structure of their marriage more clearly than almost any private conversation could have done. Years later, the family name issue was partially changed. In 1960, a new arrangement allowed descendants without royal styles to use the surname Mountbatten Windsor. It was an important recognition of Philip's family identity, but it did not simply reverse the earlier decision for the children who were already part of the royal family. One especially meaningful moment came in 1973, when Princess Anne married Mark Phillips and signed the marriage register using the Mountbatten Windsor surname. Her father was nearby. For Philip, that moment could be viewed as a quiet acknowledgement of the family identity he had spent decades trying to preserve. Philip's connection with Diana also gives this story another dimension. Diana entered the royal family decades after Philip had done so, but she faced many of the same pressures surrounding identity, expectations, public behavior, and personal freedom. The source describes Philip as someone who corresponded with Diana during difficult periods of her marriage to Charles. Their relationship was not always easy, and Philip did not agree with everything Diana did. Yet he understood what it meant to enter the royal household from outside and discover that personal choices could suddenly become matters of institutional concern. That shared experience may explain why his correspondence with Diana carried unusual significance. When Philip eventually retired from public duties in 2017, he was 96 years old. He moved toward a quieter existence at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, away from the constant schedule of official engagements. Some interpretations later suggested that his decision represented frustration with royal life or even distance from Elizabeth. But Princess Anne reportedly rejected that idea. She explained that her father simply wanted somewhere peaceful where he could live without the endless demands of public attention. That explanation is important because Anne knew Philip personally for his entire life. Her perspective challenges the idea that every decision he made in old age was secretly a message about his marriage. Philip died in 2021 after more than 7 decades beside Elizabeth. Looking back, his marriage cannot honestly be reduced to either a perfect fairy tale or a miserable royal arrangement. It was something more complicated, a lifelong partnership built around love, duty, sacrifice, hierarchy, and constant adjustment. Philip surrendered enormous parts of his original identity, yet he remained beside Elizabeth throughout her reign. And perhaps Princess Anne's perspective gives the story its most important lesson. Sometimes the truth behind a royal marriage is not one explosive secret, but thousands of compromises made quietly over an entire lifetime. What do you think? Was Philip truly unhappy, or did he simply learn to live with the sacrifices?